Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
All right, so we have a couple stories to talk about this week. The first one I wanted to start with is something I came across here, which I thought was really interesting. NIST is going to start changing how they handle CVEs in the National Vulnerability Database starting April 15th. So it was just a couple days ago. They're only going to have CVEs meeting certain specific criteria be enriched with severity scores and product list and detail analysis. Everything else that's listed won't have those details if it doesn't meet this specific criteria. And the reason is because the CVE submissions grew by about 263% recently, and it's going to continue to accelerate throughout this year. And NIST last year enriched about 42,000 CVEs, but it cannot keep up with this increased volume. And of course, like with everything that's happened with our federal government and Doge and kind of laying off people, I'm sure the reduction in numbers hasn't helped with this increase in submissions either. And so what they do, what NIST does with each one of these CVEs when it gets enriched is organizations used to be able to search in the National Vulnerability Database for vulnerabilities and then look at the severity scores and then also view any type of products that are listed to determine which systems might be at risk. That information normally isn't automatically available, just available. The NIST analysts have to add it manually, which is known as enrichment internally through NIST. So they have to put all these details into the database manually after the CVE gets submitted. And so because of this increase in numbers, NIST will now only prioritize CVEs appearing in CISA's known exploited vulnerability catalog, with the goal of enriching those within one business day, plus CVEs affecting software used within the federal government, and CVEs for critical software as defined by the Executive Order 14028. So everything else will still remain listed in the National Vulnerability Database, but non-prioritized entries will be labeled as quote unquote not scheduled, and they'll rely solely on CNA provided ratings. And it's also worth noting that NIST will not enrich CVEs with an NVD publish date earlier than March 1st, 2026, meaning the backlog effectively gets wiped. So the known exploited vulnerability catalog, so this KEV catalog, which is maintained by CISA, is deliberately conservative. One of the security researchers looked at CISA's KEV at only 15, they only had about 1,500, 1,600 some vulnerabilities, while the vulnerability database tracks over 7,000 known exploitations, meaning that there's thousands of actively exploited vulnerabilities sitting outside of this CISA maintained known exploited vulnerability catalog, KEV catalog. And so under this new policy, it's also all of these vulnerabilities are going to be outside of that enrichment too, because NIST is only prioritizing the CVEs that are in this KEV catalog. And so, this is, to me, as I was reading this, it's extremely concerning, right? Because if a CVE isn't enriched by NIST, then the tools that rely on the National Vulnerability Database won't surface it. And so teams won't be alerted if something is missed. These tools will produce false negatives, and coverage that organizations are normally relying on is no longer complete. So the new NIST policy stops producing its own CVSS scores when a CNA has already been assigned, and implicitly assuming that the CNA scores are good enough to stand alone, but analysis shows that they're often not aligned with what the National Vulnerability Database independently concluded. So, and then of course in AI world, right, in the AI age, everything is even worse, right? So with AI-driven vulnerability discovery, like we talked about last week with Anthropic's Mythos, and then OpenAI just came out, I think, with a security-focused LLM as well. They're all coming out with these new ones. And so with these AI-driven ones, the discovery is being positioned to operate at even more unprecedented scale. And so that concern is even worse when the vulnerability disclosure pipeline has no capacity to absorb that volume. And then coordinated disclosure, CVE assignment, MVD enrichment, patch availability all have to follow, a specific submission. And each one of those stages are already overloaded. Very concerning. The EU is already building their own alternative called the European Vulnerability Database, and it's been live. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, like they can't rely on our database, and obviously we're being overwhelmed here. So, and that's been live since May of 2025, and so by September of 2026, reporting actively exploited vulnerabilities will become mandatory for manufacturers under the Cyber Resilience Act. And the EU saw the risk of depending on a single US run database. And so now it's decoupling that dependence. So
Right.
NIST has admitted that the new rules allow some potential high impact CVEs to slip through, you think, and accepts enrichment requests for lower priority CVEs via email at nvd@nist.gov. Though how quickly those get reviewed is anyone's guess. So something to definitely keep an eye on, because I think we all rely on these tools, right? We rely on the database to basically be the source for our scanning tools. And if that's not reliable anymore, then, our vulnerabilities scanning will be, I think, severely deprecated.
What is CNA? You use that acronym throughout here, and I didn't see a reference for it.
That is a good question. The CVE numbering authority is what CNA stands for.
Okay. So that's you submit a CVE, they assign it a CVE number. Okay.
Correct.
And they do some scoring there.
Yeah, the severity rating is from the CVE numbering authority, which is
Got it. Okay. And so, you mentioned those scores are not considered super reliable. Obviously, the enrichment that NIST performs has been helpful. So this is interesting. And I know, dear listeners, if you've listened to the show recently, we have probably ventured into opining, or at least I have, on politics adjacent topics more than I really want to do on this show. But sometimes it's unavoidable. And I'm not going down that path today. I will just say, I know we did a show at some point in the past year, 12 to 15 months, where we talked about there was some risk of it was either CISA or NIST or a federal government authority not being funded and not being able to continue some efforts. And I don't remember if it was related to this or not. If you do, jump in. But this sounds like pretty obviously here it's the result of obviously not having enough funding to enrich everything and hire the headcount necessary to continue forward with that. And we understand there is an exponential challenge here as well, where you talked about the growth and how many more reports there have been and how much larger the problem set has become. And I am absolutely sensitive to that. And I think there's an opportunity here to look at what's the best way to handle this moving forward. Again, you mentioned things like Claude Mythos. OpenAI has a cybersecurity focused model. It is likely we will discover more vulnerabilities, maybe not necessarily high level ones, but still vulnerabilities nonetheless at a more rapid scale, just because agents don't sleep. They don't have a mortgage to pay. They don't lose interest. They can test very iteratively. We're going to see a lot of new reports. And so how do we handle that? It sounds like in some way this is getting out in front of it for what it's worth and trying to kind of set a bar for what do we enrich and what don't we, given a potential tidal wave, a tsunami of additional reports coming in. That's fair. It's also fair to express concerns with it too. I can see it both ways here. I do find it interesting. Again, I just mentioned like we have waded into politics adjacent topics more than I'm comfortable on the show. I will say, given the hawkish nature of the current administration towards adversarial nations and wanting to take a hard stance against them, this seems like a natural place to invest. Cybersecurity, we've been saying for a while, is becoming this next battlefield between nations and nation states. It seems like this is a great opportunity to invest in the defense of the United States as a really strong defensive posture. So it's all interesting. I think maybe an adjustment was necessary given some of the scale is changing. Is kind of throwing up your hands and saying, not our problem. Is that the right approach? Probably not. It'll be interesting to see how much Europe wants to pick up the slack here. I would love for them to do that. Europe in general has definitely shown a desire to decouple themselves from the United States in ways that put them at risk. And I understand that. But they tend to do it in very self-owning ways that are very like detrimental to their own purposes. I mean, how many different state governments in Germany have tried to pivot away from Microsoft Office and go to Open Office or some open source flavor and come crawling back, 2-3 years later? It's happened for the last 25 years. There's been a story of like, and I'm going to make up a state just because I know like one name, like Schleswig-Holstein has all of a sudden migrated to Open Office, and all the Linux nerds rejoice. And then they never report about how 2 years later they came back because their whole finance team demanded Excel or whatever the case was. By the way, Andy and I both work for Microsoft in our field security sales. We're not really talking about Microsoft tonight. Anyhow, this is interesting. I think stay tuned. I think there'll be some sort of industry picking up the slack here. Either that or you may see an explosion of different security vendors all doing their own kind of evaluation and numbering scheme and maybe inventing some sort of like AI powered automatic scoring systems or something. So it could get messy for a little bit, but then things tend to come back together. When you have competing efforts, everyone says, hey, this is kind of wasteful. Let's all come together and let's solve this as an industry. So maybe short-term pain, but long-term, maybe this would be a good thing. And as we've seen with kind of the ebbs and flows of United States government funding and interest, and how I think it's fair to say there's these large pendulum swings depending on the party in power, that may be unreliable moving forward. Relying on the federal government and how dramatically things shift depending on who wins elections based on how people vote in 6 states doesn't really make a lot of sense anymore. So maybe it makes more sense to kind of get away from these political machinations and do something that can be truly independent and not subject to these whims of the electorate who are mad that there was a global economic meltdown and wanted to vote the people in power out, or now they're mad that there's this happening and want to vote that party in power out, like whatever. We don't need our cybersecurity posture tied to that. And I think that's where we need to get to. So short-term pain, I'm an eternal optimist. We'll come out the other side looking better, but certainly something to be aware of in the short term.
Yeah, I went and looked back at the show that we had talked about. It was almost to the year, like last year around this time. We talked about the CVE program being under fire and MITRE losing funding.
That's okay. Yep.
And so during that time, they had talked about forming like an independent board because MITRE is also a federally funded program and was under fire then. It got an extension to March of this year, but I haven't heard anything of what would happen after that. This European database said it's been live since May of 2026, which probably formed after this whole debacle with MITRE last year, or sorry, May of 2025. And we did our show in April of 2025. Basically a year after or a month after they started probably doing their own database. And
so that's really interesting context. I'm glad you went and pulled that up.
Yeah. And so it's just like you said, that it's unreliable mainly because of how like flip back and forth this administration has been. Like they laid off a bunch from CISA. Now they're trying to rehire more people from CISA. They didn't want us to use offensive security for a little bit against Russia and whatnot. And they defunded a lot of the military cybersecurity offensive capabilities. But then recently the White House came out with a cybersecurity strategy saying, hey, we're going to be more offensive. Like you said, they're more hawkish. And so it's been like kind of like really wishy-washy messaging. But to me,
and that's
this
not
is
even getting into like the pendulum swings when you switch administrations and stuff too, which have become more pronounced too. And
right.
I don't think that's at all a one side or another political statement. I mean, I think we've all witnessed that as executive branch is using more executive orders. We've seen more bypass of things that have tended to be deferred to Congress are now being handled through the executive than in the past. And so that creates these larger swings when also there's a very pronounced phenomenon that political parties in the United States are becoming actually more pushed to the extremes, to the left and right edges, and left centrist. So that's why we're also seeing these larger pendulum swings, and all these things come together. Even you're talking about within an administration, when you have a consistent administration but inconsistent strategy, we feel that pain too. So
definitely something to keep an eye on, because it's gonna impact everyone when it comes to these vulnerabilities. And my hope is, with AI, less manual work, because and having worked with federal customers now for over a year, they're obviously very behind in some of the technology. Being more of a legacy customer, they're starting to make a lot of investments in AI. So hopefully that flows down. Maybe they'll be able to catch up with the help of AI, because I know that has definitely sped up a lot of people's work overall in the industry. Okay, so the next story I want to talk about, I saw this really interesting on the FBI 2025 Cybercrime Report. There was $21 billion lost last year. We had talked about the Internet Crime Complaint Center before, and kind of like how many. We've talked about this cybercrime report from the FBI before, and because they take into account all of the reports. If you report a crime that's like a cybercrime, you can report it to the FBI. They will log it. Sometimes they'll investigate it depending on the value and whatnot. Last year, there were 1 million, over 1 million complaints, which was 20% higher than it was in 2024, where there was only about 859,000 complaints. And then the losses from those cyber crimes in the 2025 report reached almost $21 billion. Now, interesting enough, the top attacks is what I was kind of looking for. And the majority of those complaints were phishing, extortion, and investment schemes. And so, again, kind of the old playbook is still working at a very large scale. Of course, this is not just organizations. A lot of them can be like just regular people. Like if I'm a victim of cybercrime, I can report that. But these are still things that happen all the time. Near over 1 million complaints last year. And the crypto is still kind of like the biggest target. Crypto holders filed 181 over 181,000 complaints and accounted for $11 billion of those losses, which is more than half the total. Crypto is attractive to the criminals because those transactions can be obfuscated through multiple wallets. It's also newer and less regulated. It can store a large amount of that at once, and so it can be stolen. AI scams are increasing. They're small in volume, but they do cause a lot of damage. So despite only making up only about 22,000 some of the complaints, AI-related scams resulted in almost 893 million in losses. And of course, that's obviously a very disproportionately high dollar to complaint ratio, which shows you how effective AI scams are at targeting these people.
164 complaints. So we're talking 1 million complaints. The AI ones were 22,000 out of 1 million, 22,000 out of 1 million, almost $900 million, close to $1 billion, 900 million effectively in losses. It is disproportionately high is a gentle way of putting that. That's impressive.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reason for that is just because the people just fall for these AI phishing attempts a lot higher than they do for human crafted ones. In the report, this says it's almost 4.5 times more often that they'll fall for an AI phishing attempt versus a human one. The report specifically calls out the use of fake social media profiles, voice clones, fake ID documents, and then also convincingly deep fake videos of public figures or loved ones. And so, I mean, if you see any of these AI generated stuff that's near indistinguishable nowadays, it's extremely hard to tell. I know that we played around with the voice generation on our podcast because our platform Riverside has an AI generated, way of cloning stuff. And of course, they have hundreds of hours of our voices. had him like fed it like, I don't know, what was it, like the
Preamble to the Constitution or something like
preamble
that.
to the Constitution, and he had to like read it in my voice, and it was uncanny.
It was weird.
It
And
was
that was
super
that
weird.
was like 2 years ago. Imagine how good it is now.
Yeah. I actually have I've set a safe word with my kids now, so that if they think it's like a fake thing, they could ask, what is the safe? Well, they ask a specific question, which is like, what kind of pizza do you like, or something like that, and then we have a specific combination that would trigger, this is the real person. So, and I think that's going to be more and more important, because like one of the AI scams is to call parents with the voices of their kids and say, hey, I'm in trouble, I need money sent here. And, anytime it's your kid, obviously the anxiety ramps up, and, it can sound, especially if it sounds like them, can be very feasible. The deep fake CEO scam was also used as a case study. There was a notable tactic seen earlier this year that involved deep fake versions of CEOs used to build trust, and then with victims then redirect those malicious troubleshooting software to gain access to their devices. And so, if it's like the CEO calling you and saying, hey, I need this, or whatever, it could be a business email compromise type scam, or just
Satya, is that you?
Can you imagine if like we got
Yeah.
called you on Teams and he's like, hey, I need you to send money here.
Okay, Satya, I'll get right on that.
Yeah. And the FBI also reported that scammers are using pressure tactics alongside fake identities and other AI generated content. So that combines the urgency and credibility. With many of the most significant AI cybercrimes only being spotted at the start of the year, imagine, just throughout this year and the next year, like it's just improving as AI is improving, as tools are becoming cheaper to run, and kind of quality is getting better. And so again, this was notable. I just wanted to kind of talk about this because still it's not getting better. Essentially, it's like cybercrime is getting worse, and people are getting scammed out of more money as time goes on. And I feel like it's just another battle we feel like we're losing, right? I'm not really sure what else we can do to kind of stop the stem of this,
This is one of those interesting ones where I'm confident at the enterprise level on up, they're going to have the funding and the tools to really counter this sooner than later. And we even talked about Claude Mythos being used for really good purposes in the long term. And especially how much that costs per token. Really, there's always what if it falls in the wrong hands? Well, what if it falls in the right hands too? Especially with it getting kind of early access. Anyhow, personal cybersecurity and small business cybersecurity, easily the thing that keeps me up at night the most, which is obviously an overused cliche, but so much risk here. And Andy, you talked about like how good the deep fakes are and how good the cloning is. It doesn't have to be good. That's the thing. I listen to some local sports podcasts here in Iowa, and one of the hosts loves to get into all that Facebook AI slop, especially around a lot of our famous local athletes. And my alma mater, Iowa State University, one of our star basketball players recently entered the transfer portal, Audie Crooks. She's a great female basketball player, but there was all this AI slop about like Audie saving, pulling people from car wrecks and opening a children's hospital. Like, she was making decent money from name, image, and likeness from the NIL deals in college, but not enough to like start her own children's hospital. And people just believe this stuff. Oh, God bless you, Audie. Audie, you are so amazing. Like, it just proves like it doesn't even have to be good. There's plenty of gullible people out there who will buy even the most garbagey AI slop you can throw out there. And so this person thinks it's funny to go look at all of it, but there's a real risk there too. So I'll tell you what surprised me most, Andy, as you're reporting these numbers. You gave the growth year over year, and I thought, that's it? I thought we were like starting down this tidal wave of new cybercrime, AI-powered cybercrime, and then it only grew 20%.
Well, remember, this is just the reported ones.
Right. I get that completely.
So,
this is what people a lot of people are so ashamed by this, they're not calling the FBI, right? They're not calling local law enforcement.
Correct.
But I thought only 20%. But then you got to the numbers on the AI threats, were a very small portion, but they were darn effective, which was
Yeah.
impressive. And, goes back to my point on people are so gullible and naive. I mean, imagine if you have really good voice cloning, really good deep fakes. It's come up on this show a bunch of times, and that still probably scares me more than anything because I don't feel confident in my ability to train my family to really catch these if they get hit by them. And I hope they have enough sense and wherewithal to figure it out. But it is really scary for people who aren't naturally cynical, who, naturally want to go with the flow or believe what's been presented to them. We need more cynicism than ever, unfortunately. And I don't want a more cynical world, but gosh, that is the thing that scares me a lot. And then, the trajectory is getting worse and it is growing. And I don't necessarily think we've grown FBI headcount by that much either. And we talked about some of the funding with, you just mentioned MITRE. We talked about a year ago. We just talked about NIST and CISA and the CVE thing. So it's a growing challenge. And so I think everyone listening to the show, your takeaways are keep talking to your family members, keep talking to your elderly family members, keep talking to your naive family members about not believing everything they see or hear. And have a way to validate those conversations and take that natural cynicism and validate before you take any action, I think is the biggest takeaway we can possibly have here. So,
and like cyber criminals are getting super creative. I don't know if I ever told this story, but my wife is a physician and she was called by someone at work and they said, "Hey, you were sued for medical malpractice." And this is actually a very common scam. They call doctors and they say, "Hey, you're being sued for medical malpractice and you missed your court date. And so you're going to have to go to jail or something like that unless you pay this fine." And she like looked up the number because they obviously spoofed the number for the police department downtown. And they said, "Hey, you can come back and pay this fine and then you wouldn't have to serve any jail time." And she was like, "Okay, well, how much is the fine for missing the court?" And they were like, $2,000, which like, if there was like a, I don't know, plastic surgeon or something like that, $2,000 may not be a big deal, but to a family physician, she was like, that seems like a lot of money for a court date. And of course she's married to a cybersecurity person. So that immediately like kind of piqued her, but she described her feeling as she was like, hearing the message that she was going to have to go to jail for missing court date. Like she was like, "Oh my goodness, like this is not good." Right. Like it's anxiety, you're ratcheting up the emotions and,
yep.
It's
running the playbook.
yeah. Yeah. And like, I'm sure it worked for different people.
Yeah, that's a great example. Hey, before we get to our next subject, I said we're not going to talk about Microsoft. I lied. We are. So Andy and I do both work for Microsoft in our field security sales. We record the show outside of work. As I say this, we're recording this on Sunday night about 7:45. So we do the show outside of work and self-fund the show. So our recording platform, our domain, everything we do, we pay for ourselves. We don't take sponsorship, just so there's no conflict of interest or anything else. So the opinions and attitudes you've heard shared the whole time on the show and moving forward are those of Adam Brewer and Andy Jaw, and do not necessarily reflect those of Microsoft Corporation. And so with that, let's talk about password protection, Defender for Identity.
Yeah. So our last topic that I wanted to touch on is a new feature. It's in preview in Defender for Identity. So in the XDR portal, just to be upfront, you do need a license that would include Defender for Identity. So there's a number of ways to license that: E5,
Defender Suite,
Defender Suite, yeah, so on and so forth. So you have to have that. And so if you do, you can have this new password protection policy within Defender for Identity. Now, we have talked about password protection within Entra quite a few times before. And Entra does have a password protection policy, which if you don't know about, you should go and take a look at one of our shows or read about it. But what it does is it takes a look at your password and your hash if you do sync your on-premise. So there's on-premise as well as cloud. So if you're syncing your passwords in the hash up to Entra or just your Entra passwords in general, are compared with a list of dark web, compromised, known, weak passwords that we have, as well as you could have a custom list and it just matches it. And so upon
most
password
commonly
change,
used passwords too.
yeah. And what it does is when you change your password or when you set your password, if you try to change or set your passwords and you have this protection in place and it matches one of these, known common bad, like monkey or the word password, or even leet speak variations of the word password, like PA $ U0RD or something like that. If you try to do that, it'll just say, can't do it. It blocks it. It doesn't match the policy. Please try to set a different password, right? So that's what password policy in Entra is. But this password protection is part of Defender for Identity. It's in the XDR portal, and it goes beyond that. So it kind of builds on that capability. But you have essentially a GUI now in the admin portal where it can show you not only with Entra, but also with third party, like if you have Okta or Active Directory for on-premise. So all of those hybrid multi-IDP, you have this password protection all in one area under the Defender XDR portal. And it has 4 different kind of like tabs that you can look at. The first one is password hygiene. And that shows you accounts with password weaknesses that attackers can commonly exploit. Each one item has a recommendation that you can act on to reduce the risk. And so this is kind of that quote unquote recommendation angle that most organizations kind of care about. The next one is password policies. There's another tab within the password protection tab in the XDR portal, and it shows password policies from your identity providers side by side so that you can check whether your policies meet certain security standards. So you could see Active Directory and Entra policies all in one view, which can expose gaps that you might not even know that they exist. Some people don't know, and some organizations don't know that you actually have different password policies in Entra versus Active Directory. The third tab is leaked credentials, which shows you accounts with credentials found outside of your organization. So, for example, on a public paste site or the dark web, and from that tab, you can actually reset passwords or disable accounts individually or in bulk. The bulk action is a key for incident response speed. So if you have a bunch of passwords there, accounts that have exposed passwords, you can do the bulk action and reset everyone at the same time. And then finally, the last tab is exposed passwords, which shows accounts and settings that store or expose passwords in an insecure ways, such as plain text or easily discoverable locations. So some examples include like clear text credentials in Active Directory attributes, something that may have been commonly used in the past, but like, legacy, right? You haven't scanned for it, you don't know it exists. So this will show you that because it uses AI-based detection and then reversible passwords in group policy objects. The AI-based detection of the plain text credentials in AD is really notable here. Again, that's just something that may be sitting in your AD that you haven't even thought about. It's buried. It's like reviewing, legacy GPO. You just don't know that it exists. So that reversible encryption and clear text credentials in the AD attributes are old and well-known configurations, and they're really hard to find at scale in large directories. So using AI to kind of surface all these automatically really closes that gap that a lot of manual audits miss. And so kind of wrapping things up, all this, like this is just something that if you already have and you're licensed for it, definitely take a look at it, right? And if this is something you're interested, you can always talk to your Microsoft account and kind of getting a test and seeing how this works.
I did not know about this, which is so typical nowadays. It's hard to keep up with the rate of change. I think you did a great job summarizing the existing Entra password protection and how that really only kicks in at time of password change. And so to completely clear out passwords and get to good passwords, you have to implement that before passwords cycle through. Like if you require periodic password changes, which you really shouldn't nowadays too. So that makes it hard to use. And this obviously is much broader scope than that, because that's really targeted also at, as you mentioned, on-premises scenarios. And then you benefit from it as those passwords are synchronized to Entra if you have password hash synchronization enabled. This is obviously much more broad because it covers on-premises identities, cloud identities, even third-party identities like an Okta. So that's really interesting. And then different viewpoints on it, right? Not just the hygiene, but also the already known compromised credentials, also finding exposed credentials that maybe were stored insecurely in the past. So a really high value view of passwords as we continue the war on passwords and try to get rid of them entirely. We still need to continue to secure them as long as they exist at all. And we get to that nirvana state when we just don't even have a password at all, but we're not there yet. This is, I think, great, worth checking out. It's a new feature in an existing product. So if you have Defender for Identity, there's nothing new to purchase or buy. And if you don't have Defender for Identity deployed, but you own it, never been a better time to do that, because now you get even more value from deploying that software. And really, one thing that's been clear is there's this strategic direction whereas once upon a time, Defender for Identity was solely focused for on-premises identities, the goal has really been to move to an overall ITDR strategy. In other words, identity threat detection and response that is holistic across cloud and on-premises. And so you're bringing together on-premises viewpoints with cloud viewpoints and delivering that in a holistic way. And that's really where Defender for Identity and Entra ID protection are going, is to that unified single dashboard of all your identity-based threats in a single view. And this dovetails nicely in that overall strategy.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Our contact information, along with the links to the stories that we used for our show, will be in the show notes. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, just email us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.